Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started here in a minute. And we may have some more folks trickle in here, as it tends to happen. Welcome back to you hardliners. And welcome to everybody who's joining us or rejoining us as we start the New Testament. Got some New Testament fans, all right.
She has something against the Old Testament?
I don't know.
No, it's just taking forever.
Anti-Semitic or something, I don't know. So a lot of tonight is probably going to be taken up with introduction, fair warning. We may get into a little bit of Matthew right at the end, but I'm going to give kind of an introduction in terms of what we do tonight, a little bit of introduction to the New Testament. And by that I mainly mean sort of the historical time period we're talking about, because unlike the Old Testament that spans a big period of time from about, even before 2000 BC, all the way up to, as we saw in some of the later books of the Old Testament were written in the first century BC. Everything we're going to read in the New Testament takes place and was written in the first century AD. So in the span of 100 years. So we've got a sort of a single setting for everything we're going to talk about. And so I'm going to, by way of introduction, I'm going to talk about tonight a lot about the world at that time, a little bit of the history leading up to it, between the end of what we read in the Old Testament, sort of setting the stage for where the New Testament starts. So a little bit about the Roman Empire, which had fairly recently come into existence as the Gospels start. How it got started, a little bit about the culture, specifically the Jewish culture at the time, to sort of help us understand who the players are, who a Pharisee is, who a Sadducee is, who some of these other people are we're going to meet as soon as we start reading. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of books in the New Testament. And then I'm going to switch over to talking about the Gospels, sort of specifically our introduction to Matthew, the first book we're going to be reading. So as I said, I'm hoping we'll get into a little bit of Matthew at least by the end of tonight, but a lot of this is going to be introduction, so hopefully it won't be boring. I'll try my best. As you can see, I already drew a really lousy map that is at least somewhat suggestive of the Mediterranean basin, hopefully. My Iberian Peninsula turned out okay. Spain looks all right. But the rest of it is pretty off.
Italian boots like a needle.
Yeah, it's not curved right either, but at least it'll be give you a vague idea of the places I'm about to talk about, hopefully. So when we get to the New Testament, I'll start by talking about why we call it the New Testament. All right, what a testament is. The word testament is used here in the same sense that it's used in terms of someone's last will and testament. All right, the word testament was an Elizabethan 17th century English word for a contract or an agreement. And so it's used in terms of the Old Testament and the New Testament to translate the even older word covenant. And as we saw in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, a covenant is an agreement that's issued by a king to his people when he takes the throne. So the Old Covenant was when God created the people of Israel, when he brought them out of Egypt and under Pharaoh, and brought them into their own land and made them into a nation. The Old Covenant was the covenant he made with them then, which the short summary was, I'll be your God and you will be my people. And then went on to elaborate what that means. Here's what I as your God will do for you. Here's what I expect from you as my people. So right away, as we start the New Testament, the reason these 27 books are put together and called the New Testament is that they were seen as being a new covenant, right? That this is now the covenant agreement that's been given by God to us as Christians. Because as we're going to read, particularly when we get into the book of Acts, God is going to, in the course of the New Testament, create a new people, Christians. And that new people are going to receive these 27 books as our new covenant that are going to tell us that God is going to be our God, and here's what He's going to do, and then what He expects from us as His people. So that's what we mean when we call it the New Testament. Now, in terms of the historical setting, it's very important that we remember that the Bible in general, and the New Testament in particular, is not mythology. These aren't stories, that teach some moral lesson but that aren't true. These aren't fables about God. These aren't something that someone sat down and dreamed up and imagined stories about God. The way we think about Greek mythology or Roman mythology or mythology from any other nation. One of the things that's very unique about Judaism and Christianity is that as religions, they're very tied to actual historical events. And when we went through the Old Testament and we went through all that history, we saw all these points at which, there was interaction with actual historical figures. This is just as true, if not more so, of the New Testament. Jesus comes and lives, and it's very theologically important to us, as we'll talk about more later, that Jesus comes and lives in an actual place on the same earth we live in, at a particular time in history. You could get on a plane tonight, fly to Palestine, go there, see the place where He was born, see places where He walked, see the place where He died, right? See the tomb where He was buried and where He rose again. This isn't just fiction. This isn't a novel. This isn't an interesting story. This is recounting to us events that actually happened. And so the historical setting is sort of important for that reason, and is also important in terms of us being able to understand what's going on. Because the world 2,000 years ago was in some ways very different than it is now, and in some ways pretty much exactly the same. We'll see that as we go. In general, people were exactly the same, but there were cultural things and ideas at the time that we now don't share necessarily. And so we'll be talking about that along the way too. But so part of what I wanted to do tonight was to give a little history sort of what happens from the end of what we read in the Old Testament to right before the New Testament starts in Matthew. And if you're not interested in ancient history, it'll be kind of short, so hopefully. So it won't bore you too much. But at the time we really ended, for the most part, the story of the Old Testament really runs from the story of Moses bringing the people out of Egypt, as I just mentioned, creating the people of Israel, bringing them into their own land, right? And they're in their own land. They have a king. They have a temple where they worship their God, and they have their own culture, society, and nation. They rebel against God and are sinful and end up going into exile under the Babylonian Empire, being taken from their land, losing their land. The temple is destroyed. They lose their king. But there's a promise that they receive when all that happens through the prophets who God sends to them, that's not the end of their story, that there's more to come. And there are several points in that prophecy in terms of what they're expecting to happen. One of those things is that they're going to get a new king. There's going to be a new king who comes. The Hebrew word for king is Mashiach, which means someone who's been anointed, because that's how they made you a king. They anointed you with oil. And the Greek word for that is Christos, which is where we get Christ. So they're expecting a Messiah or a Christ. They're expecting someone descended from David, one of their original kings, to come and return and sit on the throne over their nation when it's restored. They're also expecting there to be a new temple, right? that God would return to them. Because after their exile, they got to go back to the land of Judea. They rebuilt the temple again, but God didn't come back. When they built the first temple, we read in the Old Testament that God came to dwell in it. There was lights and glory and fire. It's kind of unmistakable. There wasn't, I wonder if he's there, right? He was there for sure. And before the temple was destroyed, he departed. And when they rebuilt it, nothing really happened. They dedicated it, nothing much happened. And as we talked about at the end of the Old Testament, an emperor, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, came and desecrated the temple. After he desecrated the temple, they rededicated it. And when they rededicated it, nothing happened. And so part of what they're waiting for, in addition to waiting for this king to come, is for God to return, for God to come back. And we're going to see in a minute when we get to it that different groups within Judaism had different ideas as to why God hadn't come back and when he might come back and what they might do to cause him to come back. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, roughly between the time that the people are able to come back to their land, this strip of land here in Palestine becomes known as Judea. At first, it's a province in the Persian Empire. And when I say at first, we're talking about the end of the 6th century BC and into the 5th century BC. It's part of the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire at that time was incredibly powerful. It spread all the way from India, which would be somewhere over here in my bad map, all the way through to here. This is supposed to be what's now Turkey. What was just called Asia at the time, down into Egypt. And as you saw, if you saw the movie 300, they started, the Persians even came and attacked and invaded Greece. 3 unsuccessful tries and never managed to conquer mainland Greece. But that was the extent of the Persian Empire. Then around the end of the 4th century BC, so we're talking around 323 BC or so, the king of Macedonia, which is kind of up here, Philip, has a son named Alexander who has kind of big ambitions and who rallies together a Greek army and starts by conquering Greece, then goes and conquers what's now Turkey, proceeds to go down, conquers Judea, conquers what's now Egypt, then goes east, conquers all the way to India, destroys the Persian Empire. And he becomes known as Alexander the Great. So he conquers most of the known world at the time. There's a romantic story about him in terms of how he died, because he did all that by the time he was 31, which makes me feel pretty bad at age 40. But he did all that by the time he was 31. And sort of the romantic story is that he did go back to Babylon. And he did engage in a lot of hard drinking right before he died. But the romantic story is that he drank himself to death because he looked around and he had no more worlds to conquer. Poor Alexander had nothing left to accomplish, and so he just... Now, that's not actually true. Because in actuality, he had an army with him at Babylon, he had another one mustered in Egypt, and he had another one mustered in Macedonia. And he was about to go and invade the rest of North Africa and conquer the Phoenicians over here. Then he was planning to come up through Spain and conquer Rome. But he never got to do that. Because at 31 he died. That probably would have taken him till 40. But so that was by the time he was 31. So when he dies, Alexander the Great dies, one of the byproducts, and reasons why this is important to the New Testament, of him conquering all this territory is that he spreads the Greek language everywhere he goes. Everywhere he goes, he brings Greek language and Greek culture with him. In addition to being obviously a great warlord, Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle, the philosopher who was tutored by Plato. So he was not an intellectual slouch either. So he brought Greek culture and language to this whole section of the world. And this is why even later under the Roman Empire, the entire New Testament is written in Greek. the Old Testament, remember we had things in Hebrew and things in Aramaic, and then they were translated into Greek, and we talked about all the different versions of things. Well, for those of you who got tired of that confusion, you'll be happy to know in the New Testament, there's only one version of all the books, and they're all in Greek, and that's it. So, for this reason, feel free to bring whatever version of the New Testament you want. It's not going to be the same issue as it was with the Old Testament. I'm going to be, when I read the English, I'm going to be reading from the Orthodox Study Bible, which is basically the New King James Version. But none of them will probably be so far off that you can't follow what I'm doing. And it's not going to be whole chapters different like it was in the Old Testament sometimes, so you don't have to worry about it. But so he spreads Greek language and culture all over at least the eastern half of the world. And when he dies, he didn't have a son. So there was nobody to sort of inherit this huge kingdom he conquered. And as he was dying, they asked him, his generals sort of gathered around him and asked him who he wanted to take over for him. And his response in Greek was kratatos, which means the strongest. So they took his suggestion literally and all proceeded to murder each other for about 150 years. That was to see who would come out on top. And it became apparent after about the first 80 years or so that none of them was going to pull off conquering the whole thing. So the four who survived, at least to that point, got together and sort of drew borders. And said, okay, instead of, we're all that's left, instead of massacring each other and diluting what we've got, we'll just split things up. And so basically this section, what's now Turkey and Greece, right, was under the king of Macedonia. The eastern part of the world, starting from the eastern bank of the Mediterranean, including Judea, not going down into Egypt, but including the Sinai Peninsula and everything east of there, all the way to India that Alexander was conquered, was taken over by his general Seleucus. And Egypt and the rest of Africa that he'd conquered was taken over by Ptolemy, another one of his generals. And so they each, in their own little piece of territory, set up their own empire. Seleucus' empire is sometimes called the Seleucid Empire, it's sometimes called the Syrian Empire, because he built a new capital, and he named it after his son. And that new capital is on the river Orontes, right about there, and he named it Antioch. So that's where the city of Antioch came from, in terms of both our archdiocese, and we're going to run into it obviously in the New Testament here, the city of Antioch. But that city is built to be the capital of this Greek Syrian empire. And that happens around, we're talking about around 200 BC. So after this, for several years, even though they've agreed to divvy it up, they tend to continue to fight amongst themselves. Around 175, somebody we just got finished talking about in the book of Daniel, around 175 BC, Antiochus IV, who took the title Epiphanes, which is the same word as our holiday Epiphany. He was saying that he was the manifestation of God on earth, because he was a humble guy. Antiochus IV, he tried several times to invade Egypt under the Ptolemies, and failed pretty much every time. But the most important time that he failed was in 164 BC. He failed, and in trying to figure out why he failed. Because before they would make these invasions, the general Greek practice at this time was they would go and they'd sacrifice a bunch of animals to their gods. And while they were making the sacrifices, they had these guys who were experts in what's called extipacy. And what they would do is they would come and look at the organs of the animals that they sacrificed. And based on the organs, they thought they could predict what was going to happen in the future. So you're about to go to battle, you go and you sacrifice the animals, they come and look at the organs, and like if they find a misshapen organ, they say, oh yeah, well, this battle's not going to go so good. Look, the gods are trying to tell you. Right? And so you'll read some stories. Before one battle, they killed a bull and then it had no heart. So they knew that that was a bad sign of something, right? So,
Bad sign today.
yeah. So he had all his guys out there to do the rituals. They did all the rituals the right way. They read everything the right way. Right? He was supposed to be successful, so he goes into battle and he loses. Right? So he says, "Well, okay, what happened? What's the problem?" Well, some people point out to him, well, you've got this province in your empire, Judea. And the Judeans who live there don't worship our gods. They don't worship the Greek gods. They only worship their own God at this temple they have. And so Antiochus says, that's it. Right? This is why the gods are mad at me, because I've been letting these my subjects not worship them. So he goes back to Jerusalem, capital of Judea, goes to God's temple there, and sets up a big statue of Zeus and sacrifices a bunch of pigs to Zeus on the Jewish altar. As you might imagine, the Jewish people got upset. This event, as we talked about in the book of Daniel, is referred to as the abomination of desolation. That's how upset they get, right? Because obviously they say, well, we can't use this temple anymore, right? Because now it's got pig blood all over it. It's got this statue of Zeus, right? So this begins what's called, and we read about this in the book of 1 Maccabees, the Maccabean Revolt. It's called the Maccabean Revolt because the main leader of it was a man named Judas Maccabeus. Maccabeus is Aramaic for the hammer. So he's got a pretty cool, Judah the Hammer, right? If you're looking for a name for your baby, right? Old Testament saint, Judah the Hammer. Right? So he and his brothers managed to rise up and overthrow the Seleucids, overthrow the Syrians. People were so incensed they all rallied behind them. And once they gained their independence, they did two things that seemed smart at the time, and it ended up not working out so well for them. They were about to get reinvaded by Antiochus, who obviously had a much bigger army than they did. And so to try to back him down, they started making some peace treaties with other people. They made one peace treaty with Sparta in Greece, that's right about there, right? That one went okay. The other peace treaty they made was with a city that was just sort of getting started as a world power over here in Italy called Rome. That one's going to go kind of bad. Right? So they make this peace treaty with Rome. Rome, for its part, has just finished destroying the Phoenician Empire. The Phoenician Empire was mainly a shipping empire. It was headquartered not over here in the city of Carthage in North Africa. They had wiped Carthage off the face of the earth. They had 3 wars with Carthage, the Romans did. In the third one, they not only completely tore down the city, they went into the fields around the city where they grew crops, and they worked salt into the soil. So nobody could come back there and grow anything. So Carthage, they just wiped it off the face of the earth. This made them the new power in the western part of the Mediterranean. So the Maccabees thought, well, if these guys have our backs, right, this will back off Antiochus' armies. And it did that at first. The Romans basically sent a very threatening letter to the Roman Senate, sent a very threatening letter to Antiochus Epiphanes, and he did not reinvade. All was well and good until the Romans themselves decided that maybe they'd kind of like to conquer the world. Right? They said, well, we did pretty good getting rid of Carthage. Now we control this whole part of the world. Greece and Egypt are looking kind of nice. And so They first invaded over the course of the 2nd century. They invaded Greece, mainland Greece, and the Peloponnesian conquered it. And in the process destroyed the city of Corinth. When we get to the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we'll talk more about that. Corinth was destroyed and rebuilt by the Romans. Then proceeded to work their way down, continuing their invasions. Now, as I said, at this time, Rome is a republic. They're governed by a senate, an elected senate. Around the beginning of the 1st century BC, there's going to be a president of that senate named Julius, who, sort of like Alexander when he was sitting there in school, decided, you know what? I think I kind of want to take over the world, and I don't think I need these senators to help me. So, after he had conquered most of Gaul, which is what's now France up here, he came back to Rome and declared himself emperor. Right? And that he was now going to be in charge. The Senate didn't like that, and they responded by, after he gave a speech in the Senate, stabbing him 23 times in the back. So, to express their distaste over the idea of him being the new king. And famously, it was one of his best friends, Brutus, who gave him the last stab, and he turned to him and said, "Et tu, Brute," which is Latin for "you too, Brutus." You and you, even one of his best friends jumped in there. So this started essentially a civil war in the Roman Empire, and the two main factions in that war were led by Mark Antony on one side, who was Caesar's adopted son, and his nephew Octavian on the other side. And the two of them made alliances. Mark Antony's most famous alliance was with the female descendant of the Ptolemies, who was ruling as Queen of Egypt at the time, Cleopatra, who at the time was cheating on him, actually, with the then current king of Judea, that being Herod the Great. But that being the most famous alliance. All of this culminated at the Battle of Actium, which is right about here, in 31 BC. In 31 BC, Octavian won, killed Mark Antony, had Cleopatra drugged back to Rome and paraded around in chains. She then committed suicide by snake, which is a really creative way to do it. If you have to have a cobra handy, let it bite you. But so that was the end of civil war, and Octavian changed his name to Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus. And at that point, Julius Caesar had tried it. He did it for real. He became the emperor of Rome. The word emperor is from the Latin imperator, which means conqueror. Okay? So Octavian becomes the sole ruler of everything Rome controls, which is the entire Mediterranean basin at this time. Everything that I drew on the board and a little more land over this way. He becomes the absolute ruler. There's still a Senate, but they don't get to do much. Right? They get to give him honors on occasion. Now, in addition to this, in addition to becoming the absolute ruler in a political sense, we have to understand there was no separation of church and state at this time, right? Even close. So one of Augustus's other titles was Pontifex Maximus, which means high priest. So he was not only the head of the state, he was the head of the Roman religion. So he is the one who offered the sacrifices for the Roman people in Rome. Right? He was a priest of their gods. And this is going to get handed down to the other Caesars after him. So both secular power and religious power is completely in this one person. He hires a few people to run propaganda for him. One of them is named Ovid, who wrote the Metamorphoses. May have read that in high school at some point. Ovid was basically a poet who he hired to write the history of the world in poetic form. The history of the world climaxing in, you guessed it, Caesar Augustus. He also hired Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid. Right? At this time, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were already popular, so he hired Virgil to write a sequel about how they all ended up in Rome and ultimately Caesar Augustus, right? Yeah. So he literally had his people rewriting history to make Caesar, rewriting history to make Caesar, again, who is now the head of church and state, right? To make him the climax of all history. He takes titles to himself like Savior of the world, right? Because he saved the Roman world from civil war, right? Bringer of peace, right? And Lord of all the earth. Because he proclaims Julius Caesar, his uncle, to have been a god, he proclaims him a god. And so he takes the title for himself, Son of God, Filii Deus. Okay. So one of the reasons I'm going into this is as we start reading, it's going to be important to remember that a lot of the titles that they're going to start giving Jesus, right? When they call him Christ, saying he's the King, when they call him Savior, when they call him Lord, when they call him the Son of God, every one of those is treason. Every one of those, the writers of the New Testament could literally be executed for, just once. Right? The Romans caught them saying that about anyone other than Caesar. So it's a piece of the background there. So at the time that Jesus is born, where the Gospels begin, Augustus is still reigning. He's later succeeded by his son Tiberius. And Tiberius is going to be emperor for most of the rest of Jesus' life. And then we'll get into after that as we go. Right? Because we're going to get into some real fun emperors like Caligula and Nero who had some odd hobbies. But for our purposes, Augustus and then Tiberius, we're still at the very early stage of the Roman Empire. Right? So the Roman Empire is very fresh. As I mentioned, in Judea, Herod the Great, once the Romans came through and conquered this territory and used their treaty that they'd made with Judea to annex it, they set up Herod the Great to be, he was given the title king, but his actual title was ethnarch, which means ruler of the people. And the reason that's an important distinction is that Rome really didn't care about the people who were there because they weren't Romans. As far as Romans were concerned, there were Roman citizens, and you had to earn your citizenship. It's not like the United States today where if you're born here, you're automatically a citizen. You had to earn your citizenship. The most common way to do that was through military service. You'd serve about 10 years in the military, and if you survived, at the end of it, you'd become a Roman citizen. Once you were a Roman citizen, right, then you had all kinds of legal rights and privileges in the Roman Empire. If you are not a Roman citizen, then legally you were non persona, you were a non-person. Right? So you had no rights whatsoever. You were basically looked at as a particularly annoying form of livestock. Right? That was they looked at, when they conquered like Judea, they looked at the people living there the same way they looked at the cows and the sheep and the goats living there. Except the cows and the sheep and the goats were less likely to stage a revolution. Right? So they're a little more easy to deal with. Okay? So Herod is made the king of the people there. Right? And one of his primary jobs is basically just keep the peace, keep them from acting up. Right? Don't make us come back here. Right? Just keep everything settled. Herod the Great happens to not actually be Jewish. He was a Nabatean, which at the time means he was from the peninsula down here. He's basically an Arab. And so he was not real popular right off the bat with the Jewish people, that the Romans had come in and made this Arab their king. Right? So he went out of his way to try in every way possible to ingratiate himself to them. The biggest way being he started a renovation project of their temple. Right? After their temple had been rededicated, after they'd retaken it, he starts expanding and building upon it in this 46-year building project that actually never quite finishes. He wasn't quite done with his plan when it gets destroyed again, but I'm jumping ahead. So he's in the midst of building this huge temple complex, which he again thought would cause everyone to like him more. In actuality, it further alienated the Jewish people because they said, I don't want to go into this temple that was built by this Arab. They say he's not even Jewish. Why were we going to do that? So it kind of didn't work for him. And things go so poorly during his reign. We're actually going to read in the Gospel of Matthew about how he dies, which isn't pretty. But things go so badly during his reign that the Romans decide this setup isn't working. And so after he dies, they divide Judea into 4 pieces. And they give 1 piece to each of his sons. And so that's why the Herod we read about mostly in the Gospels is not Herod the Great, but Herod the Tetrarch. Tetrarch means basically king of a fourth. So, because he's got one little piece. It's basically a figurehead. Basically a figurehead as far as the Romans are concerned. The Romans have their own governor of Judea. And as we see toward the end of Jesus' life, it's going to be one guy in particular, Pontius Pilate. We'll talk more about him when we get to it. But they have their own governor. But he's the governor of the land. Because what the Romans wanted, they didn't care about the people again. They wanted the land, the natural resources, the roads for trade routes, right? Those were the things they were interested in it for. And the people were kind of an inconvenience. So lastly, by way of New Testament introduction here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the different groups that exist among the people in Judea. Okay? So living within the big pagan Roman Empire now, ruled over by Caesar Augustus, we've got in the little province of Judea, the Judean people. Right? People who have the Old Testament as their scriptures, right? Are trying to follow, worship their God, and follow the Old Testament. They're aware of the fact that they're in abject poverty, right? They have no rights. They're essentially slaves like they were in Egypt, for all intents and purposes, to the Romans. And they're waiting for these prophecies to come true, that they're going to have their own king come back, that God is going to return to them. And so they sort of form different factions within themselves. And some of the major ones that we're going to see pop up here as we go through the Gospels. The first one, and the one that we're going to see the most of, is the Pharisees. Now, Pharisees, their name comes from a word that means essentially pure or clean. They believed that, they looked back at the Old Testament and they said, well, God sent us all into exile because we were wicked and we didn't follow the law. We didn't follow what He told us we were supposed to do, how we were supposed to live our lives. So He left, right? And we were destroyed. So if He hasn't come back yet, that must be because we're still sinful. We're still wicked. So what needs to happen is the people need to start following all the rules of the Old Testament. They need to follow them all perfectly and in detail. Right? Got to do everything right. And when we get everything right, then God will come back. So they take the laws in the Old Testament. There's about 387 of them. They take those and they say, well, to make sure nobody breaks any of these laws, we got to clarify them. Right? For example, you're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath day. Well, what constitutes work? Right? Like, if I walk 10 feet, that's not really work. Like, if I walk 10 miles, that's probably work. Right? So we're going to have to make a decision on this. We're going to need a ruling. How far can you walk on the Sabbath day? So, okay, you can walk this far. Okay. Well, what about your donkey? If you're riding your donkey, does that count as walking? Are you making the donkey work? Right? So they go in and they build this whole longer list of rules. And they describe it as building a hedge around the law. Right? So if we've got a rule here, we put a hedge around it out here. And that way, nobody will even come close, right, to breaking any of the laws. Right? Nobody will come even close. We can become pure, and God will come back. And so, for example, another one. You're not supposed to take the name of the Lord in vain. We're not supposed to take the name of the Lord in vain. Well, what's taking it in vain? Why don't we just never say it? Right? We never say it, we never write it down, we can't take it in vain. Perfect, right? Problem solved. Right? So they construct these additional rules. And so within their philosophy, first of all, they've got to follow all these rules. They've got to make sure everyone else follows all these rules. And anyone who isn't following all these rules, like say your tax collectors and your sinners, right, they become the enemy. Because it's not just that they're choosing to live their life differently than I am, right? It's people like them are stopping God from returning. People like them are why we're slaves to the Romans. So when we see the Pharisees turn up in the Gospels, 9 times out of 10, right, they're showing up to point the finger at somebody, right, as the enemy. Criticize them, to criticize Jesus for coming within 5 feet of them, right? Or something similar. But that's their mindset. And of course, St. Paul, who's going to end up writing most of the New Testament, was one at one point. But we'll get there. But this was their mindset. But so, on the good side, they were sort of the religious conservatives at the time. At least they were trying to follow, well, they were trying to live the way God wanted them to. On the negative side, right, They were doing it in the worst possible way, right? And this is a lot of what St. Paul is going to talk about. Because of the Pharisees, is talking about following the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, right? Those kind of things. That you're doing all these things in detail, but you don't really love anybody, and you're not, particularly joyful, and you don't have a sense of peace, and you're not, where are all the blessings that were sort of the point of following this in the first place? But we'll get there. So another group beside the Pharisees who we're going to see are the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the exact opposite of the Pharisees. The Sadducees basically are the ultimate realists. They've decided, well, this is the boat we're in, right? Yeah, there's some prophecies that claim God was going to come back when we rebuilt the temple, but he didn't. So those must not be part of the Bible. They only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament as actually being scripture. Right? They threw all the rest of it out. And for the most part, they said, well, those prophecies said there was going to be a king. Well, we got a king, Caesar. He's a perfectly good king. So most of them decided that Caesar was the Messiah. So they just decided to kind of collaborate. And in return for that, the Sadducees got all the really good jobs. So the high priest in the temple, Sadducee, right? All the high priests, when we read about the Sanhedrin, sort of the religious authority, council, mostly Sadducees. Right? They scratch Rome's back, Rome scratches theirs. Right? And they called themselves the Sadducees because, as we read in Ezekiel back in the Old Testament, God prophesied that when the new temple came in the age to come, that the priests who served there would be the sons of Zadok, who was one of the high priests in the Old Testament. Well, they weren't related to Zadok in any way. But the word Sadducee, you can see if you take out the vowels, you've got Saduk, that's from Zadok. So they named themselves the Zadokites. To say, oh yeah, we're those people who were prophesied in the Old Testament. We're the new priests, everything's fine. So they basically took the opposite path. Nothing's wrong. This is how everything was supposed to be. Yay, Rome. Now the Essenes were sort of similar to the Pharisees, but a little more extreme, in that they were so concerned about following the Old Testament and hated the Romans so much that they believed they had to get out of Roman society completely. So they went off into the desert and formed their own little communities and tried to ignore the Romans as much as possible. And they wouldn't use the temple in Jerusalem because they decided that was bogus. They lived off in their own little communities. There are a lot of theories. We don't have any facts or archaeological evidence to base it on. But there are a lot of theories that St. John the Forerunner, St. John the Baptist may have been an Essene. That he may have essentially been of that kind of mindset. But there are several little groups like that. One of those groups was near a river crossing named Qumran. And if you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls were one of these groups of Essenes, their collection of scrolls. They were one of these groups that went out into the desert. And then finally, the last group were the Zealots. The Zealots were the opposite of the Sadducees in that they thought now was the time to rise up and overthrow Rome. They believed that it wasn't a question of sitting around and waiting for God's kingdom to come. We need to go out and do it. They sort of believed in following old Judah the Hammer's example. We just need a big enough army and we could throw off Rome. And then whoever our leader is at the time will be the Messiah. They're going to end up doing bad by the people of Judea in a big way. Just to jump ahead a little, because between 66 and 68, they're going to start a revolt in Jerusalem, and the Romans are going to come and destroy the temple because of it. And then around 132 AD, they're going to stage another big revolt to try to overthrow the Romans, called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. And the Romans are going to come in and literally wipe the city of Jerusalem off the map for 300 years. So their plan going to go a little awry. Okay. So those are the four major groups we're going to run into here as we get into the New Testament and the Gospels. Okay. So that said, that's the end of my New Testament introduction. Now, introduction to Matthew before we start Matthew. In the New Testament, we've got essentially 5 groups of writings. The first one is the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then, in terms of the Old Testament, or in terms of the New Testament, the second big division, we have the Gospels on one hand, and then we have the works of the apostles on the other. The reason I say that is, in our Orthodox practice, we have 2 readings in liturgy on Sunday, and in the daily readings normally, outside of Lent. You've got a gospel reading from one of the 4 Gospels, and then the book that the other reading comes from is called in Greek the Apostolikon, meaning the book of the apostles. And all of these other books are written by Jesus' apostles. That's why they're called that. Now within that, there's the book of Acts, which sort of continues the history of what happened with the early Christians after the end of the Gospels. And then there are letters written by St. Paul, letters written by other apostles, and then the book of Revelation that's sort of in a special category on its own, because it gets a little wild again, like we saw in Daniel. But we'll get to Revelation in a couple of years here. And you laugh. People also laughed when I said we'll get to the New Testament in about 4 years, and look where we are. But for now, we're starting with the Gospel of Matthew, so we're going to talk a little bit about what a gospel is. First thing I want to point out is that the way we normally name the Gospels is wrong. And in fact, referring to them as the Gospels plural is technically wrong. Even though I've just done it about 5 times. In reality, the book, what we call the book of the Gospels in English, is in Greek. And I only write things in Greek because I'm still paying for it. It's called the Evangelion. It's singular. It's the book of the Gospel. And technically, the titles of the 4 Gospels are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the Gospel, singular, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. The point being, all 4 are telling us one story. All 4 are telling us one story. But it's 4 different witnesses telling us that one story. So, it's not 4 separate stories. And this is really important in terms of how we're going to understand as we go through the Gospels. We're going to see, we're going to read the same story. Sometimes we're going to read it 4 times. And it's not going to be identical any of the 4 times. Okay. There's a lot of different ways you can deal with that. One way that people like our friend Bart Ehrman deal with that is to say that, well, look, they disagree, so this is all nonsense, it's all made up, blah, thrown away. Right? Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. St. John Chrysostom makes an interesting, I wish Father Chris were here to back me up on this since he did investigations, but St. John Chrysostom makes the point that if you've ever investigated anything, and you grab 4 eyewitnesses, and you separate them, and you ask each of the 4 of them to tell you what happened, right? And they actually saw it, they will not all agree on everything. Right? They will not all agree on everything. They'll have things in a different order, right? Or they'll have things a little different. Whereas if you grab 4 people who have made up a story, because they got caught doing something, then it'll match perfectly. Right? Because they all got together and got their stories straight. Right? So St. John Chrysostom says the fact that there are these little differences is proof that it's true. Right? It's proof that it's real eyewitness testimony, and that's why it's a little different. But it's interesting that there was not a point in the church's history where there were less than 4 Gospels. Meaning, it's not that the church had Matthew and things were okay, but then they found this other one, Luke, and they said, well, I guess this one's good too. Oh, hey, here's John, right? You know, and added them. Right? From the very beginning, they had all 4. They had all 4. And they were at least as smart as you and I. It's not that they didn't notice that there were differences. Right? It's not that, what? All of a sudden, 2,000 years later, we're sharp enough to pick up on the fact that, there's 2 angels at the tomb in Luke and only 1 in Matthew. What do we do now, right? They realized that there were differences. But the point was, as John Chrysostom makes the point, that we're looking at the testimony of 4 different people toward this one story. And we're going to see that those little differences are going to make differences in terms of how an event is portrayed and how we read it and how we understand it, but they don't necessarily exclude one another. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a concrete example. This is jumping way ahead to when Christ is dying, but it's a good example. In the Gospel of Mark, right, Jesus is dying on the cross, and the people are taunting him. The other thieves who are being crucified next to him are taunting him. The Roman soldiers are taunting him, and they go and they stick a sponge on the end of a spear. They stick it in a bucket of gall and vinegar in order to poison Jesus, right? In order to make his suffering worse. And they go and they shove it in his face to make him drink it. That's how Mark describes it. When we read St. John's Gospel, Jesus is dying on the cross. And he looks at one of the Roman soldiers there, looks at him and says, "I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty." And the Roman soldier dutifully runs over, right? Even though he's executing this person, right? Runs over, puts the sponge, right, in wine and gall, and runs over and gives it to him so he can have something to drink. Same event, Jesus is dying on the cross. Roman soldier takes a spear, puts it in a sponge, puts it in the bucket, gives it to him. Right? But they're making two different points. St. Mark in his gospel is showing us how Jesus is the victim, sort of all of mankind's evil and spite. Right? All of our sin, all of our wickedness, all of our spite is kind of dumped on him in that one moment. St. John is making the point that even while Jesus is hanging there on the cross dying, even while he's hanging there bleeding and can barely breathe, right? Who's the one who's in control of the situation? Jesus. Right? Jesus gives an order and there goes the Roman soldier to go away. Both of those can be true. Both of those can be true. It can be true that Jesus was still in charge of the situation. Right? He was still God. He was laying down his life deliberately. They weren't murdering him. He was laying down his life by his choice. Right? That can be true that St. John is telling us. And what St. Mark is showing us, that Jesus was the victim of all of our human envy and spite and hatred. Both of those can be true at the same time. And so what we have in the gospel, we have events in the life of Jesus that are so important, right? So important, so crucial, that not just one perspective is going to give you the whole truth. Not just one person's way of seeing it, way of understanding it is going to give you the whole truth. And so we get these four different perspectives, according to St. Matthew, according to St. Mark, according to St. Luke. We get these different perspectives to try to give us as many angles, right? If it's a three-dimensional object, right? As many angles as we can get to try and give us as much of the whole picture of who Jesus is and what he did as we can get. So part of the reason I go into that now as introduction before we get into Matthew is, for this reason, I'm not going to be jumping back and forth between the Gospels. Right? Like I'm not going to take a story in Matthew and say, okay, well here's how Mark tells it, and here's how Luke tells it, and here's how John, and try and fit them together. Right? Because I don't think that's not what they did. They could have done that. The church could have taken the four of them and just sort of smushed them together. In fact, they did that in the 3rd century. It was called the Diatessaron. Right? But that's not what ended up in our Bible. Right? What's in our Bible are the 4 separate books. And so we're going to read each one separately and talk about what each one is saying. Because that's how they're in our Bible, and that means that's how God is using them to speak to us. Each one individually, each one with its own teachings, its own emphases. Right? All those kind of things. So, now, Matthew in particular. That's the Gospels in general. St. Matthew's Gospel is generally considered to be the most quote-unquote Jewish of the Gospels. Well, what does that mean? What that means is, in the Greek of St. Matthew's Gospel, there are a lot of what are called Aramaisms. At the time that Jesus lived, at the time that these things happened, the people of Judea were still mostly speaking Aramaic. The very educated ones knew Greek. Like we're going to see St. Paul being an educated rabbi. His Greek's pretty good. But for the most part, they may have known a little bit of Greek that they used to trade with people. That kind of thing. But day to day, in their house, in their kitchen, they were speaking Aramaic. Well, in the Greek of St. Matthew's Gospel, a lot of that Aramaic kind of creeps through. In terms of the way words are ordered, in the way there's even some odd spellings here and there. But it is to show that Matthew's gospel, some people, including a few of the church fathers, even thought that he might have originally written it in Aramaic. And then it was translated into Greek. But St. Matthew's gospel also has a lot of connections and allusions and quotes back to the Old Testament. He's very interested in showing how Jesus, in his life and in his death, his resurrection, is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies to the people of Judea. In terms of when it was written, in general, most people agree now. Everybody never agrees on everything. So people have to write doctoral dissertations on something. But in general, there's an agreement that St. Mark's Gospel was the first one that was written. It was written around 69. Generally, people think that St. Matthew's Gospel was written sometime in the 70s AD. So we're talking about within 40 years after Jesus died. So right before we start, just a note on that. You'll often hear, if you watch the History Channel, which I don't recommend, aside from shows about aliens, you'll often hear, you'll often hear, it's history with quotation marks. When they start talking about the New Testament, you will start to get this business about how everything in the New Testament was written decades after Jesus lived. Decades! Right? Like that's a long time. The first book that was written in the New Testament is Galatians, which was written around 45. So that was about 13 years after Jesus died. Gospel-wise, we're talking about 69, which is about 37 years after Jesus died. Okay. This is not a huge span of time. Right? This is 37 years. Right? St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, in fact, makes a list of a whole bunch of people who saw Jesus after he rose from the dead, who are still alive. He says, if you don't believe me, go talk to. Right? He lists these people. And then he says, oh yeah, and on this one occasion he appeared to 500 people. Then you can go talk to them. So this is not a huge span of time. To give you a comparison though, between the time Muhammad is supposed to have lived and the time when we first have a mention of the name Muhammad, not any facts about his life, not a copy of the Quran, a mention of the name Muhammad, it's on a coin, right, is more than 150 years. More than 150 years. I've never seen anyone go on the History Channel and say Muhammad never existed. Now there may be other reasons for that, why they wouldn't want to go on the History Channel and say that out loud. But the point being that our evidence about Jesus is much better than our evidence about any other religious figure in the history of the world. There's nothing written about Buddha until about 3 centuries after he's supposed to have lived. So when they talk about decades, and we're talking about 13 years, 30 something, this is really a short span of time. It's really a short span of time. They'll also tend to say, and none of them were written by eyewitnesses. Well, some of them claim they were written by eyewitnesses. The people they're interviewing just assume that that's not true. That's not true. When we get toward the end of the Gospel of Matthew, and we get into the stories of the appearances of Jesus after his resurrection, I'm going to talk more about this, because the stories of his appearances after the resurrection, which are the Gospels that we read during Matins, by the way, those stories show signs of being a lot older than the Gospels they were in a lot of cases. And probably go back. Even a lot of non-Christian scholars now agree they probably go back to the original eyewitnesses, the original Christians. So don't be bamboozled by that. That's a lot of throwing mud in the water to make it look deep, right? there's not really anything there. They're just trying to cast doubt on things. So that said, we usually go a little longer, so let's do some actual Bible, let's say. I've drained the enthusiasm from everyone. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start Matthew 1, verse 1. I'll wait till I hear the flipping stuff. Back when I was a Protestant pastor, see, this was the trick. You'd announce what passage you were going to read, and then everyone flipped there in the Bible. So you'd hear flip, 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 flip. And you wait until the flipping ceases, and then begin. Okay, so Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So right off the bat, and I'm not going to take a poll of how many people were here when we talked about Genesis, but Matthew 1:1 basically quotes the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, the whole book, when we talked about it, is divided into 5 pieces. And the way each of those 5 pieces start is, this is the book of the generations of someone. Right? So at the beginning of Genesis, this is the book of the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then it's the story of creation. This is the book of the generations of Noah. Right? You get the story of Noah. This is the book of the generations of Abraham. Well, St. Matthew, right off the bat, verse 1, right, is telling us that what he's writing, he considers to be a continuation of the Old Testament scriptures, right? By starting it this way. This is the book of the generations of Jesus, right? Who's the son of David, the son of Abraham, and who's the Christ, right? So he said 3 things here. He's the Messiah, he's the King, Jesus is. Number 2, he's the son of David, which is what we'd expect if he's the king, right? He's descended from King David. And then finally, he's the son of Abraham, right? Meaning going all the way back to the promises God made to Abraham and to his seed, right? To his descendants, back in the Old Testament, that all of these now are coming to bear in Christ, in Jesus. So verse 2, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab, Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. Some great names in there. Again, if you've got any relatives who are pregnant, Amminadab, be the only Amminadab in his preschool class, I guarantee you. You can call him Minnie for short, right? But now notice, here we're starting with Abraham, right? He's the father of the Hebrews, of the Jewish people, and going through till David. What's interesting is some of the people who, specifically some of the women who are mentioned here, if we don't remember them from the Old Testament. So notice, for example, Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, remember the story of Judah and Tamar. It's what they don't tell you in Sunday school when you're 5, 6, 7 years old. It's a little unsavory. But at that time, if you were married and you died before you gave your wife a son, right, to carry on the family name, then it was, if you had a younger brother, it was your younger brother's job to give your widow a son who would carry on your family name, right, and who would inherit. That's how the social responsibility worked. So Judah has a son, marries her to Tamar, son dies, right? So Tamar doesn't have a son to inherit Judah's fortune. Well, Judah's son has a younger brother, Onan. So he says, Onan, now you need to marry Tamar and give her a son. Well, Onan goes and he sleeps with Tamar, but shall we just say he makes sure that she's not going to get pregnant by taking certain actions. So because he hasn't lived up to his responsibility to his brother, God strikes him dead. Okay? So now, Judah's got 2 dead sons, right? He's got Tamar, his daughter-in-law, who's a widow. He's supposed to have his 3rd son marry her and give her a son to inherit as well. Well, he decides, this one was bad luck, right? I'm not marrying my 3rd son to her. That's crazy, right? So he sends her back to her parents. Okay. Well, she goes back to her parents. She's got nothing, right? When her parents die, she's a widow, right? In that culture, you got no rights. It's not like she could go get a job, right? It wasn't going to happen. She was going to be begging the rest of her life. Right? So Judah had done pretty wrong by her, right? By shipping her off. So she comes up with a plan. She goes and disguises herself as a prostitute and lures Judah himself into sleeping with her and gets pregnant. Yeah, gets pregnant. So Judah finds out, oh, my widowed daughter, she's pregnant, right? What? And he's incensed, right? That apparently she's been. So he drags her into court because she's pregnant. He's going to have her stoned to death, right? For sleeping around. Tamar was smart again and kept Judah's walking stick and his signet ring, right? And so when Judah says, tell us who it was who got you pregnant, she says, oh, it's the guy who owns this stuff. And Judah kind of goes, no, right? And says, okay, I was in the wrong.
Case
Right?
dismissed.
Yeah, she's in the right. Okay.
I rest my case.
Yeah. He's like, drop all charges, right? So she's set free. But now notice, we're reading Jesus' genealogy. Jesus' family tree. We're about 3 names into it, and we get to the son who was born from that situation. Okay? That's one of Jesus' ancestors. A little further on, we run into Ruth. If you remember in the book of Ruth, Ruth wasn't even Jewish. She was a Moabite. Right? She was a Moabite who again got widowed. And who Boaz married in sort of a similar situation to redeem her from a life of begging. Right? And it's her son. Notice also, someone begot Boaz by Rahab. Does anybody remember who Rahab was? Rahab was another prostitute. She was a prostitute who lived in the city of Jericho, who helped the Jewish spies basically conquer Jericho. Now let's just pause for a second. Let's say for a moment you're a person who thinks that Jesus is a fictional character. Right? And that St. Matthew, for example, was making up this fictional character who he was going to say was the Jewish Messiah. And was writing a fake family tree for him. Is this what you would pick? Are these the people you'd want to go with in the family tree? Right? I don't think so, but... Okay, so picking up with David. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam, Rehoboam begot Abijah, and Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat begot Joram, Joram begot Uzziah, Uzziah begot Jotham, Jotham begot Ahaz, and Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh, Manasseh begot Ammon, and Ammon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. So this list, starting with David, these are the kings of Judah, between basically the start with David until the people go into exile. Again, I'll note, David begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. That would be Bathsheba. If you don't remember that story, that would be the woman who David, already having several wives, was out walking around on the roof of his palace, saw her taking a bath a few buildings over, had her husband murdered so he could add her to his harem. Okay. Again, if I was making up a genealogy for my fictional Messiah, I would not probably take this route. Yes. Verse 12, and after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel. Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begot Abiud. Abiud begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim, and Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan. Mathan begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until Christ are 14 generations. So a couple of things here. What's the importance of this 14 generations thing? Well, 14, I think this is a new messy board record for me. 14 is 2 sevens. It's 2 sevens, right? So you've got 7 generations, then another 14, then another 14. That means you've got 6 sevens, which means that when Jesus is born, that makes him the 7th, the beginning of the 7th. 7. So 7, as we talked about at a couple points in the Old Testament, the number 7 represented completeness in that world, because as far as they were concerned, there were 7 planets. But as far as they were concerned, that's 7 planets, so it represented the whole universe. 7 days in a week, right? A complete week. So the idea is here that he's the 7th. We also saw, remember in Daniel, the prophecy that the exile was going to go on for 70 weeks. 77s, right? And so that's part of this too, is that Matthew is, by using these numbers, setting up to say that Jesus is the end of this process, right? But now, to go back to what we were noticing before in terms of who's included in the genealogy, what is this process? Right? Because, again, you'd think our Messiah, our Savior, the one who's going to redeem Israel, would come from a little better stock than a bunch of foreigners and prostitutes and murder and adultery and all these other things. What Matthew is showing here is that God is working in and through all the messiness, right? The messiness of human history and human life. Like I said way back at the beginning of my New Testament introduction, God isn't somewhere outside of our history far away from us, right? It's sort of this mythological world, doing these sort of pure and holy and wonderful things and some other. God is working here in this world with us, with actual human beings, right? Actual human beings who are sinful, who are fallible, who get into these kind of messed up family situations, messed up situations created by our own sin, right? And that God is bringing redemption and salvation out of that. Right? Out of that. Because as St. Matthew looks around Judea, and it looks around his world, right? And contra the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees wanted to get everything perfect. If we get everything perfect, if we get everything holy, if we get everything righteous, then God will find us acceptable. God will decide we're acceptable and he'll come back to us. Right? St. Matthew's saying the exact opposite. God's fully aware of just how messed up we are. Right? And how very messed up we can get. And he's working in and through that to bring about our redemption and to save us. And it's not about us somehow becoming acceptable or us somehow creating some pure breed, right, Messiah, or us getting everything right to make this come about. God is going to do it. He's going to make it come about. Right? Not in spite of us, but in and through even our bad decisions and bad choices and the mess we make. That's what St. Matthew's getting at. That's why he includes those people. That's why he includes those people. Because as he goes through the rest of his gospel and he presents to us himself, the other disciples, they're not going to be your paragons of virtue and your fine upstanding citizens of Judea or anywhere else. Right? There are going to be a whole lot of people with their own issues and their own flaws and their own. But these are the people who God works through. These are the people who God chooses. This is how salvation comes about, is in and through even those flaws. Even those bad things. I think we could finish chapter 1 here. Verse 18, now the birth of Jesus was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Now I'm going to pause a second here, remember how we're doing this. We're reading how Matthew describes it. I know Luke 2 describes it too. We've all heard Linus recite it. And it was beautiful. But don't bring what Luke says back in the back. We just want to read what Matthew has to say. We'll get to Luke. We'll get to Luke and read what Luke has to say. So here's how Matthew sets it up, is right off the bat, right? It's sort of a mystery story, right? Because Joseph is betrothed to Mary, right? They haven't had any kind of relations, and she's pregnant by the Holy Spirit. That's what we're told. So verse 19, then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. Right? So Joseph is a good, decent guy, right? Because legally, could have been a lot like Judah and Tamar. Right? He was betrothed to her, she got pregnant, he could have taken her to court, right? And said, clearly she's been cheating around on me, she could have been killed. Right? He could have had her put to death for betraying him and sleeping around. Right? And I don't think they would have bought her story, probably. That it was a virgin conception. I seriously doubt they would have believed her. But Joseph doesn't do that, right? Joseph is a decent guy, right? It's apparent that since he's trying to put her off, he doesn't really believe her story at this point either, right? But he's not trying to get revenge. He's not her trying to get mad. He just says, well, we'll just quietly, send her to live with someone. It'll be okay. Verse 20, but while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So, this story, the angel comes to Joseph, right, to explain to Joseph, look, go ahead and take her as your wife because corroborates her story. Right? Corroborates the story. This is true. She's conceived by the Holy Spirit. You're to name her son Jesus, which is... Wow, I made a mess. Jesus is actually the Latin form. And again, I'm only writing all this because I'm still paying for it. Of Yeshua in Hebrew, which is the name Joshua. We translate it as Joshua in the Old Testament. But Yeshua is the word for salvation in Hebrew. In Greek, it's Yesu. And that first letter, Jesus, depending on how it's conjugated, that first letter, when you see an icon of Jesus, it has that, it looks like ICXC right at the top. What that is the C is another way of writing the S, the sigma on the end of his name. And the I is the first letter of his name in Greek. So the IC is actually IS. It's abbreviation for Jesus. And then the XC is the abbreviation for Christos, which starts with what looks like an X and ends also with an S. So it's an abbreviation in Greek for Jesus Christ. That's what the ICXC is. But so his name, his Hebrew name means salvation because, as the angel says, he will save his people from their sins. He will save his people from their sins. So this is not just salvation in a general sense, right? But the people of Judea, the problem that God is identifying that needs to be solved is their sinfulness. So the Pharisees are sort of half right. They're sort of half right. They're right about what the problem is. They don't realize they're part of the problem. But they kind of realize what the problem is. But they have no clue how God's going to solve it. What he's telling Joseph is, it's going to be through your son that God's going to solve this problem of the people's sins. Verse 22, so all this was done that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Let's pause a second there. The prophet he's referring to is Isaiah. Who's Isaiah? Specifically, it's Isaiah 7:14. And this has become a hugely controversial verse. That's why I'm pausing here. And this is one that, again, if you make the mistake of watching the History Channel or National Geographic documentaries about Jesus or any of these things, they will jump all over this. Because what they will say is, if you go back and actually read this prophecy in Isaiah, this prophecy in Isaiah takes place during what was called the Syro-Ephraimite War, which, to make a long story short, Judah and Israel were fighting each other. And the king of Judah is in trouble and asks Isaiah, is the Lord going to deliver us, or are we going to lose this war? And Isaiah says back to the king, a young woman here will bear a child. And before that child is old enough to know right from wrong, meaning while it's still a baby, God will give you victory in this battle. And they'll call the baby's name Emmanuel, and as Matthew points out, Emmanuel means God is with us. Okay? So our friends on the History Channel and National Geographic, etc., will say, that verse doesn't actually say anything about a virgin. Right? It says a young woman, the Hebrew word is almah. And on top of that, it's not talking anything about the Messiah or anything else. It's talking about God delivering them during the Syro-Ephraimite War. So, is Matthew just completely making this up? Right? Did he just try and come up with some random prophecy that seems to kind of fit? Well, a couple things here. First of all, St. Matthew isn't the first one to translate this word young woman in that prophecy as virgin. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was made about 250 BC, so a long time before Jesus, that was translated as, in Greek, Parthenos, which means virgin. But Parthenos doesn't just mean virgin in the general sense. What do I mean by virgin in the general sense? It doesn't just mean someone who hasn't had sexual relations. Parthenos has a technical meaning. It means a religiously dedicated virgin. So, for example, in Rome, they had the Vestal virgins who worship the goddess Vesta. We read back in 2 Maccabees that there were virgins at the temple. To put it in our more modern terms, Parthenos is something like the equivalent of nun. Right? Of a nun in Christian practice. So, we're about 3 weeks from the feast of the entrance of the Theotokos into the temple. And on that feast day, on November 21st, we celebrate when Mary, as an infant, was brought to the temple and given in the temple to serve there in the temple as a Parthenos. As a Parthenos. And that's where she grew up. When she came of age, right, and went through puberty, because of the cleanliness rules at the temple, where you couldn't have any blood, she had to leave, and that's when she was betrothed to Joseph, who was an older man who was widowed, who already had children. So, Mary was not just any random young woman. She was one of these. So when St. Matthew quotes this from the Septuagint, he doesn't just have in mind, in terms of the quote from Isaiah, this idea of someone having a child, right? He's quoting it in the Greek for this specific reason. And again, the punishment for one of these, whether you're in Roman society and you're talking about the Vestal Virgins, or whether you're talking about one in the temple who got pregnant, was death penalty. Was death penalty. So, St. Matthew is saying this was fulfilled uniquely in Mary. Yeah, lots of young women have lots of children. This was fulfilled uniquely in her, first of all, because she was one such dedicated person, right? Who had dedicated her life to God. But also secondarily, because he's looking at not just the quote in Isaiah, but he's looking at the whole passage. This is going to be important as we go through the Gospels, and even into St. Paul's epistles. When the New Testament writers quote something from the Old Testament, we have to remember they didn't have chapter and verse divisions. Those got put in during the Middle Ages. So St. Matthew couldn't say, go read Isaiah 7:14 and following. Right? He couldn't give like a paragraph, right? So the way they quoted was, they quoted the first line. That didn't mean they only wanted you to read the first line. They quoted you the first line to say, go to the book of Isaiah, start here. Right? Start where it says, a virgin shall give birth and you will call his name Emmanuel, and read the following. And what he's looking at is not just that one verse, but at the whole pattern of that passage, which is what? Which is what? A child is going to be born in Judah, or in this case Judea. A child is going to be born in Judah. And when that child is born, you are going to know, because that child has been born, that God is with you and that he's about to deliver his people from their enemies. That's what Isaiah is saying to the king. Child is going to be born, and when he's born, you'll know God is with you, and he's going to deliver you from your enemies. That's what St. Matthew is saying about Jesus. Child is going to be born, and when he's born, you're going to know that God is with you. He's going to deliver you from your enemies. Why is that God is with you part so important? Remember what I was saying about the temple. God never came back yet. God is still gone from their perspective. Right? So St. Matthew is saying, when you see Jesus born, you'll see that he is with us. He's back. Where? In the person of this baby. In the person of this baby. So the importance of what St. Matthew is saying doesn't hinge on how you translate this one word. Right? He's saying, look how God has dealt with his people in the past. That's what he's doing again now. But on a bigger scale. Right? On a much bigger scale. Okay. And that's why you'll even hear some of those people make the silly statement, well, his name is Jesus, it's not Emmanuel. Again, that's not what it's not how he's quoting it, right? That's not how St. Matthew or any of the other New Testament authors understand the way the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament. It's not this quote thing, right, where I find this quote that says, oh, and now look, something just like that quote happened, right? It's talking about patterns of how God deals with his people and how he reveals himself to his people. So now this last bit here, verse 24. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called his name Jesus. Right. So Joseph, still being the good guy he was before, right, says, well, angel testimony good enough for me. Right, so he doesn't put Mary off, and she gives birth to her son, and they name him Jesus. Really brief note on that until. Right? It says, did not know her until she had brought forth her firstborn son. Many of our Protestant brothers and sisters will harp on this verse to say, this stuff that the Orthodox Church teaches about Mary having been always a virgin, right, that's nonsense. See, look, it says Joseph didn't know her until she gave birth. Right? And they say, well, that means that afterwards he did. Well, I'm going to steal my response from St. Jerome, because there were people making this argument all the way back in the 4th century already. St. Jerome went to the book of Genesis, and he said, he went to the story of where Jacob steals his father-in-law's idols, and he goes and buries them under a tree. It says he's buried them under the tree, and they have not been found until this day. St. Jerome says, does that mean they found them that day? He says, no, that means they never found them. Right? That means they never found them. Right? And he says, Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy, and they say his body has not been found until this very day. Does that mean we just found it? Nope, we never found it. Right? So, this word until does not necessarily mean, in English, that sounds like it implies, until and then afterwards. But it doesn't imply that at all in the original. Right? It doesn't imply that at all. But more importantly, and I'll finish with this, more importantly, when we talk about, and in Greek, again because I'm still paying for it, it's ei parthenos, meaning eternally or ever virgin, right? We talk about the ever virgin Theotokos. When we say she's ei parthenos, we're not primarily, although that includes the fact that she didn't have sexual relations with anyone, that's not primarily what we're talking about. Because remember, parthenos is like none, right? What we mean is, Mary was a woman who was dedicated to God at her birth, and she remained dedicated to God until the day she died. Right? From birth to death, the whole time. Right? It wasn't, well, she was special as a kid, and then she gave birth to Jesus, and it was like, well, my job's done here, and she went off and became a housewife, right? That's not it, right? Because we're going to see her all throughout Jesus' life. We're going to see her after his death. We're going to see her after his resurrection. We're going to see her all the way to the day of Pentecost, where she's with the disciples, right? She was one of the ones who received the Holy Spirit and prophesied, right? So it wasn't, it's just, she gives birth to Jesus and then we're done with her. Her whole life from start to finish was dedicated to God and to her son. Right? Start to finish.
How old was Mary then when she gave birth to Jesus?
Probably around 14 or 15.
And Joseph had grown children, so he wouldn't.
He was advanced in age.
Yeah, he was considerably older than her.
Which is why he sort of disappears from the Gospels, because he passes away. Well, Jesus is still relatively young. Okay? So, yeah,
You know, here it says, in the footnote, it says that verse does not imply that Joseph did know Mary
Right.
after Jesus.
Right.
In the verse it says that he took her
as his wife, yeah. But he didn't have relations with her.
That's what.
Right. Okay, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Lord willing, see you next week.